Hey everybody, welcome to Frannie Square. Today is part 1 of how to read a crochet pattern, and we're going to be starting a crochet along as well. So stay tuned. So I've been reading all of your comments and I love getting them. Keep them coming. It helps me to learn about you and to learn what content you'd like to see on the channel. And one thing I kept coming across is that there are many people who want to learn how to read a crochet pattern. So I figured it would be fun if we learned how to read a crochet pattern together while also crocheting the project that the pattern is written for. So as I've said many times, fall is my favorite season. And I love the clothes, the boots, the sweaters, the jeans, the food, the stews, the soups, the apple pies, getting ready for the holidays. My favorite season, hands down. So I figured I would pick a pattern for the upcoming fall season. So I found a cardigan that I would like to wear, and I thought it would be a great project for us to learn how to read the pattern, and we can also make a cardigan for the fall season that's coming up. So I'm going to put a picture of the cardigan up here, and you can see that it has a nice drape to it, and I really like the shape of it. The other thing that I really like about this pattern is that it's an easy pattern, and as we get into making the cardigan, the stitch is so easy that you won't need to keep referring back to the pattern, so it'll become a mindless whip. The other thing I like about this pattern is that there are plenty of things to learn from it. First, the yarn that's called for in the pattern has been discontinued. So we're going to talk about how you can substitute a different yarn into a pattern and the criteria I use for choosing the substitute yarn. Also, the pattern is a 5-piece pattern, so we'll learn how to make separate pieces and then put them together. And finally, there's a stitch diagram for this pattern as well. Albeit a small one, it's still a stitch diagram, so we can start learning how to look at those also. So I think this is going to be a great project for us to do together. We'll get something really nice out of it in the end, and we'll learn how to read a pattern. Now I've included a link to the pattern in the description below, so just go click on the link, download and print out the pattern. And then we're going to start going through the pattern. So I'll see you back here in a minute. Okay, so here we have the pattern. On the top page, we see the name of the cardigan, the pattern number, and the designer, and the picture of the finished project. Okay, so when we turn to the first page, we see the skill level is easy. And then it'll tell us the sizes that we can make this pattern in. So we have small, medium, large, 1X, and 2X. And for all the instructions in the pattern, you'll see everything that is meant for the small size will be outside the parentheses, and everything for the medium pattern will be the first thing listed in the parentheses, large, the second, 1X, the third, 2X, the fourth. So it will always be in that order. Now, the finished chest measurement, and this is how you can decide which size you're going to make, for the small will be 36 inches. It's outside the parentheses. For the medium is 42 inches, the large 45 inches, 1X 50, 2X 53. You can also look at the measurements in centimeters as well. The finished length for the small is going to be 26 inches. Medium 27, large 28, 1X 28 and a half, 2X 29, and again the measurements in centimeters. So everything that you see that has parentheses, you'll know which one you're supposed to follow. Now, once I choose my size, I always get out my highlighter and I highlight every spot that is meant for me to follow so that I don't get confused. So I'm going to do the small size. And I'm just going to highlight in the spots where the instructions are for me. It says, note, pattern is written for the smallest size with changes for larger sizes in parentheses. So that's what we just looked at. When only one number is given, it applies to all sizes. To follow the pattern more easily, circle all numbers pertaining to your size before beginning, which is an excellent piece of advice. I use a highlighter. You can circle whatever works best for you. Okay, Now the pattern's broken out into different pieces. So we had the skill level, and it talked about the sizes here. Then we have the materials we're going to need, the gauge, that's when we get into doing the swatch, the stitch explanation. Now in this section here, this is where you'll see explanations about how to do a specific stitch that's referred to in the pattern, such as a cluster stitch, a V-stitch. In this case, it's a V-stitch, and it explains to you what a V-stitch is, and we'll get to that. Then it tells you the pattern here, the pattern stitch, and it tells you, and we'll go through this in detail, row 1, row 2, and any notes that you need to know for this pattern. And then it will start with each piece of the pattern. So we're going to make the back of the cardigan first, and we'll shape the armholes. Then we'll make the left front, shape the armhole, the collar extension, the right front, shape the armhole, the collar extension again for that side. Then you have the sleeves that we'll be making. Any finishing instructions, such as putting the pieces together, edging for the sleeve, edging for the cardigan. Back here is our key, so we will know what all of the abbreviations in the pattern mean, and we'll take a look at that before we start the pattern. Here we have our stitch diagram, and as I said before, it's not a big stitch diagram, but this is great because it'll give us a chance to look at how stitch diagrams are written and what they look like, and we'll go over that as well. And then in the back, you have each of the pieces, what they look like, and the measurements of them. So here's your back piece. That's what it's going to look like. Here's your left front. Your right front is just going to be the mirror of your left front. And your 2 sleeves. So those will be your 5 pieces that we'll be putting together in the end. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning now. We looked at the parts of the pattern. We went through the sizes. Now let's look at the materials. So the first thing we notice is this calls for Lion Brand Touch of Merino yarn in color 113 beet red. Now again, here we have the parentheses with the numbers. I'm going to highlight the one for my size. I'm going to need 6 balls of the yarn. For a medium, you'll need 7. For a large, 8. For 1x9, 2x10. Now, as I said before, this yarn has been discontinued. So let's talk about how I choose a substitute yarn for a pattern. And I do it often, even if the yarn's not been discontinued. Sometimes I just want to use a different yarn. So the first thing I do when I'm looking for a substitute yarn is I have to figure out what are the attributes of this yarn that I'm trying to match. And I look for 3 main things. And if you're wondering how I got this information, I just Googled Lion Brand Touch of Merino yarn label, and I got to look at the label and get this information off of it. Okay, so the first thing I look for is the weight of the yarn. And the Lion Brand Touch of Merino is a 3-weight yarn. The next thing I look at is the fiber content. It's 90% acrylic, 10% mohair. And then finally, I look at the number of yards or meters per ounce or gram, depending on whatever measurement is on the skein. So for this yarn, there's 257 yards or 235 meters in 3.5 ounces or 100 grams. So the closer I can match these items, the better the substitute yarn will be. Now I don't match them exactly, and you'll see in my choices of yarn. So the one thing I do like to do is choose the same weight yarn. I find that to be easier. So I did look at 3-weight yarns, and I'll show you what I'm looking at. Okay, so in looking at yarns that I might substitute, I started out with a Lion Brand yarn called True Blue. And if you haven't felt this, you have got to feel this yarn. It is so soft. It's 100% rayon from bamboo, so it doesn't match the fiber content. This is 90% acrylic, 10% mohair. However, it is a 3-weight yarn, And for 3.5 ounces and 100 grams, there's 241 yards or 220 meters. And here this is 257 yards, 235 meters, close enough for me to consider this yarn. So you see, I'm not going with the same fiber content, and I'm not really sure how this will work up, but once we do our swatch, then we'll have a better idea. But I do love the feel of this. Okay, the next yarn that I'm looking at is Ice's Alara yarn, and if you watched my flash review on it, you know I like this yarn. This one is a 3-weight also, and this comes in 50 gram skeins, so I have to double it to make sure I'm comparing apples to apples. So in 100 grams, I get 280 meters, plus or minus 5%, it says there. And here for 100 grams, I have 235 meters. So still in the ballpark. And the fiber content is 50% acrylic, so it does have the acrylic in there, and 50% cotton. So this is another one I'm looking at using for the project. And then finally, I have another ice yarn that I have really been wanting to use. I've had this yarn for a long time, and this is a 3-weight, I believe. It's hard to see, but it looks like it is. It's a 20% cashmere, 50% silk, and 30% merino, so it in no way matches the fiber content of the suggested yarn, but I really think this would make a nice warm cardigan for the fall. In 100 grams, because this comes in 50 grams, so in 100 grams I would have 250 meters of yarn, which is pretty close to the 235. So I feel like these 3 yarns are a possibility, and I'll know better, like I said, when I do a swatch. One yarn I really wanted to look at using was this one, but it's not the same weight, and it just didn't match up for any of these 3 criteria, so I have to put it aside and save it for later. I love this yarn. I have to figure out what to do with it. Okay, so those are the substitute yarns I'm considering. Now, when we substitute a yarn, we also have to make sure we have enough of the yarn. So for me, the pattern says I'm going to need 6 balls of the Touch of Merino. So 6 balls for 235 meters per ball gives me 1,410 meters that I'll need. And you can do that in yards, meters, whatever you want. So I have to make sure that I have enough of these other yarns. So for the True Boo, that comes in, so for the True, this is falling apart here, I don't know what's happening. For the True Boo, that has 220 meters per skein, I take the 1,410 that I need, divided by 220, and I get 6.4, or approximately 7 skeins. Okay, now I have 8 skeins of the True Boo, but I have it in 3 different colors. So that's something to consider, because I think I want to do this cardigan in one color, so I'd have to go out and buy more True Boo. Not sure I want to do that. I'm going to put that aside for now. The Alara is 140 meters per skein. So 1,410 divided by 140 equals 10.1 skeins. So approximately 10 to 11 skeins. I only have 8 of this in one color. I have several colors, and again, I could piece together colors and try to make a striped cardigan, or do the sleeves a different color, or the collar a different color, but I don't really want to do that. Okay, now this yarn, I have 125 meters per skein. There it is. So 1,410 divided by 125 equals 11.28. I'm going to call it 12 skeins that I need. And I'm in luck. I have a lot of this yarn. I have about 16 skeins of it. So this is the yarn that I'm going to do my first swatch with to see if it works out. If it works out, I'm going to be using this yarn. If not, I may revert to one of those other yarns and just bite the bullet and order some more. Okay, so now once you've chosen the yarn that you think you want to substitute, we have to make sure it's going to work. And by using the gauge, we can make a swatch and we can see, how does the stitch work with the yarn we chose? Is there enough drape to the fabric? Does it give us the feel and the look we're looking for? So how do we read the gauge? Well, this says 11 V-stitches plus 20 rows equals about 8 inches. Before we get to looking at this, I want to go back to our page with the abbreviations on it so that we are all speaking the same language here. Okay, so if you go to the page with the abbreviations, this is like your key. You can just take this out and keep it next to you if you like until you get used to the abbreviations. BEG equals begin or beginning. CH equals chain. CH dash space equals chain space previously made. DC equals double crochet. REM, remain or remaining. REP, repeat. RND, round. RS is the right side of our work. SC is a single crochet. SK equals skip. SL, ST is a slip stitch. ST or STS is stitch or stitches. And WS equals the wrong side. So these are pretty easy to remember, but if you need to, you can refer back to these abbreviations. Now let's take a look at the gauge. So the gauge says 11 V-stitches plus 20 rows equals about 8 inches in the V-stitch pattern. Be sure to check your gauge. I find that to be critical, especially when you're making a garment. And if you're substituting yarn, even more critical. All right, so what's a V-stitch? Well, right below it, we have the stitch explanation. Each action is separated by a comma. And when something's in a parentheses, you're doing it all normally in the one stitch or space. So a V-stitch is a double crochet, chain one, double crochet, in the indicated stitch or space. Okay, and we'll do it together so you'll see what that means. Now, the gauge says it should be about 8 inches in the V-stitch pattern. So let's go to the pattern stitch and see what that means. The V-stitch pattern is in a multiple of 3 stitches. What does that mean? Let's take a look. Okay, we start with row 1. And we're going to V-stitch in the 6th chain from the hook. Now, each piece that you do will have a different number of chains, so that's why it's not telling you what number of chains here. But you know you're going to start your first V-stitch in the 6th chain from the hook, and the 5 skip chains count as 2 base chains and your first double crochet. Then you're going to skip the next 2 chains and V-stitch in the next chain. So we V-stitched in the 6th chain from the hook, then we skip the next 2 chains, and we V-stitch in the 3rd chain from there. And then this says repeat from the asterisk, so this is the asterisk that we're repeating from, to the last 3 chains. So we're going to do this over again. Skip the next 2 chains, V-stitch in the next chain. Skip the next 2 chains, V-stitch in the next chain. We're going to do that over and over until we get to the last 3 chains, at which point we're going to skip the next 2 chains and double crochet in the last chain. So that's how the first row of our V-stitch pattern works. Now, if this seems like a lot to take in, don't worry. We're going to do it in the swatch together. I just want to get you used to looking at the instructions. Okay, Moving on to row 2 of the stitch pattern, because we're going to be doing 20 rows in our gauge, so we want to know the whole pattern stitch and how it works. For row 2, we're going to chain 3, which counts as a double crochet, and turn our work. So at the end of row 1, basically you're chaining 3 and then turning your work. Then you're going to V-stitch in the chain 1 space of each V-stitch across. So everywhere you made a V-stitch in your first row, you made the double crochet, the chain, the double crochet. In that chain space of each V, you're going to make another V-stitch. Then you're going to do that all the way across till you get to the end where you double crochet in the top of your beginning chain. And then after that, we're going to repeat row 2 for the rest of the pattern. So now we know how the pattern works. We know which yarn we think we want to substitute. If we go back to the materials, we know we're going to start with a J size hook, which is a 6mm hook. And we also need a large-eyed blunt needle. So I typically will start with the hook that they recommend, and then once I look at my swatch, I measure it and I see, well, is it about 8 inches? If it's not, then I either move my hook size up or down. If my swatch is too small, that means I need a bigger hook. If my swatch is too big, then I need a smaller hook to make it tighter. Okay, so I have actually already started doing my swatching, and I'll show you what I've gotten so far. Okay, let's move this out of the way. So first I started with a J hook, and I made this swatch. I really am loving the stitch pattern. Look how pretty that is. I'm loving the drape of this fabric, so that I really like. I think it's going to feel nice in a cardigan. Now when I measure it, remember it's supposed to be an 8-inch square. If I measure this direction, it's about 8 inches. But when I measure this direction, it's over 9 inches. So that's too big. So that's what I got using a size J or 6mm hook. Too big. And that little bit of difference over a whole sweater makes a big difference. Okay, so then I moved to a 5mm hook. Now, for this I did 1, 2, 3, 4. I've done 18 rows. And I'll tell you why I stopped. So going across, again, about 8 inches, that looks good. Going this direction, I'm already at 8.5, and I've only done 18 rows. That's why I stopped. So next, I'm going to try using a 4.5mm hook. Now I know that I tend to crochet very loosely, so this is not a surprise to me. So I'm going to get my 4.5mm hook, and I'm going to start a swatch, and we can swatch together. All right, so to start the swatch, just going to make my slip knot. Now the first thing we're going to need to do is figure out how many chains do we need to make for our swatch. So let's look at the pattern again. It says we need to do 11 V-stitches. And then when I look down here, it says a V-stitch pattern is in a multiple of 3 stitches. Well, we've seen that the V-stitch pattern works that you make a V-stitch and then you skip the next 2 chains, so that's 3 stitches, and then you make your next V-stitch and you skip 2 chains. So it's 3 chains you'll need for each part of the V-stitch pattern. So for 11 V-stitches times 3, that would be 33 chains I need, but the first V-stitch doesn't start until the 6th chain from the hook. So I'm going to need 33 plus 6, or 39 chains for my swatch. Okay, so let's make our 39 chains. And if you see, I have a different hook here. I bought 6 different kinds of hooks. I'm trying them out and I will be doing a review on them. I bought sets of hooks. I've gotten some recommendations from you that I wanted to try out, and some that I've been wanting to try anyway. So we'll see how this goes. This is a pony hook. And that was a recommendation from Stacy Hortner. If you were watching one of the show and tells, it might have been the second one, I'm not sure, her work was in it, and she made that unbelievable felted dog. And she said she really likes these hooks, so I figured I'd give them a try. I love learning from you guys, so keep the suggestions coming. And the sets that I bought range anywhere from $7 and change up to like $58. Let me see how many chains I have here. Okay, looks like it's 37, 38, and 39. There we go. All right, so if we look at our instructions, we are going to V-stitch in the 6th chain from the hook. So we're going to count our 6th chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the 6th chain, and our V-stitch, if we look, under stitch explanation, is a double crochet, chain 1, double crochet into the indicated stitch or space. So we're going to double crochet, chain 1, and double crochet again into that same chain. Okay, and there's our first V. Okay. Now, next thing we're going to do, if we look at this, is we're going to skip the next 2 chains and V-stitch in the next. So we're going to skip 2 chains and then V-stitch in the 3rd chain. And then we're going to repeat from the asterisk this over and over again till we get to the last 3 chains. So skip 2 chains, V-stitch, skip 2 chains, V-stitch. Okay, we just worked in this stitch, so we're going to skip this chain and this chain, and we're going to V-stitch into the next one, which again is a double crochet, chain, and another double crochet. And we'll skip the next 2, 1, 2, into the 3rd one there, do the same thing, and do that all the way across until you're 3 chains from the end. Okay, and I'll meet you back here at the end of this row. Okay, so we get to the end of our row, we have 3 chains left, and we're going to skip 2. Oh, let's look at the pattern here. So to the last 3 chains, then we're going to skip the next 2 chains and double crochet in the last chain. So we're going to skip the next 2, 1, 2, and in this last one here, we're going to double crochet. There we go. Now, our gauge said that we should have 11 V-stitches. So let's take a look at our first row, make sure we have 11 V-stitches. So here's my first one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 V-stitches. Perfect. Okay, now moving on to row 2. We're going to chain 3 and turn. Okay, so grab my working yarn here, chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn, and that's going to count as my first double crochet. That's what it said there. Counts as double crochet. V-stitch in chain 1 space of each V stitch across. Okay, so here's our first V-stitch. it's a double crochet, here's the chain one and double crochet. So my chain one space is that right there. So I'm just going to make a V-stitch into that space. So I'm going to double crochet, chain, and double crochet into that same space. And this way our V's are going to be right on top of each other. Okay, so there's a V on top of the previous V. Then we go over to our next V, which is over here. Here's my chain one space. So I'm going to make another V-stitch in there. Double crochet, chain one, double crochet. And there we go. Okay. And we're going to do that all the way across in every V-stitch, in every chain one space in the V-stitch, all the way across. And then when we get to the end, okay, V-stitch in chain one space of each V-stitch across, and then at the end you're going to double crochet in the top of the beginning chain. So go do your V-stitches all the way across in all of your chain one spaces, and I'll meet you at the end. Okay, so I've V-stitched all the way across in all the chain one spaces, and now I'm at the end, and it says to, and it says to double crochet in the top of the beginning chain. So the beginning chain was a chain of 3, which we can see right here, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to double crochet into the top of that chain there. There we go. Okay, so there we go. That's the end of row 2. Now, if we go back to the pattern, it says repeat row 2 for the rest of the time. So for our last 18 rows of this gauge, we're going to just be repeating row 2. So again, we're going to chain 3 and turn. 1, 2, 3. And we're going to begin making V-stitches in every chain 1 space across. So do that for a total of 20 rows, and then you can decide, is your swatch the right size? If your swatch is too small, then you need a bigger stitch, which means you need a bigger hook. If your swatch is too big, you're going to need a tighter stitch, which means you're going to need a smaller hook. And you can do trial and error till you get the right size swatch, and your swatch should be about 8 inches. Let's look at our swatch. Should be about 8 inches square, okay? Okay, so you can go ahead, finish up your swatching and choose your yarn. Okay, so I wanted to just show you the difference between the swatches. This swatch was made with the size 6 hook. This swatch I moved down to a size 5 hook. And then here I used a 4.5 hook, and this swatch measures my 8 inches, 8 inches by 8 inches. So the 4.5 hook is the hook that I'll be using for this pattern. I like the feel of the swatch, the drape, and the stitch using this yarn. I'm going to stick with this yarn and use a 4.5 millimeter hook for this pattern. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to go over with you today is the stitch diagram. So here's the stitch diagram. Like I said, it's small. We only have 2 rows. You can see this is row 1 and this is row 2. Here is our key. So the oval equals a chain, and then this bar with 2 lines going across it equals your double crochet. Now we start from the left here, and we see our chains, and we see that our first V-stitch takes place in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th chain. And in that chain we do a double crochet, a chain 1, a double crochet, and then we skip 2 chains. That's exactly what we did. We do that across. When we're 3 chains from the end, 1, 2, 3, that's our last V-stitch. And in the very last chain, we do a double crochet. Then we chain 3 and turn our work, and then we work our V-stitches into the chain 1 space of each of the V-stitches below, and then we end with a double crochet. And we just repeat this row. It's a 1-row repeat, which means this is the row that you can continue repeating. You don't repeat both rows. And that is how easy it is to read a stitch diagram. Okay, so that was part 1 of how to read a crochet pattern and of our crochet along for making this cardigan. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below or send an email to my email address, franniesquare@gmail.com, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. Also, I plan to continue teaching how to read patterns even after we finish this project, because there are more and more complicated patterns that we can start looking at. So if you see a free pattern that you think would be helpful for everybody for learning how to read a pattern, send the link to me. I'm still collecting projects for this week's show and tell, so don't be shy. Everybody is loving looking at the projects from our community. Send in your pictures with your description so I know what to say about your projects to the community. Everybody is looking forward to seeing your projects. Okay, so I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and I hope you're joining along and making the cardigan with us. And as always, thank you so much for joining me. I truly appreciate it. Remember to make it your own, and I'll see you soon.